My name's Barry Judd. I am normally Professor of Indigenous Social Research down at Alice Springs and a colleague of Michael's and others around the room within the Northern Institute, but maybe I'm here in my acting capacity as Pro-Vice Chancellor Indigenous Leadership. That's who I am. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we meet here this evening on the land of the Larrakia people, land that was never ceded, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. Also acknowledge other Aboriginal people who are in the room with us today, and the rest of you who are supporters of Aboriginal Australia through research, teaching and other educational activities. In many ways I feel like it's a bit of, I shouldn't be here introducing Michael Christie, because he's a bit of a living legend throughout the country as far as I can figure out. Ever since I've moved to Charles Darwin University and people ask me where I work, I say I work at CDU and I work in the Northern Institute, and their immediate response is, oh, so you work with Michael Christie. So Michael is very well known, and I'm just going to read off some of his history so you get an understanding of his commitment to Indigenous languages over many decades. So, Michael Christie is a Professor of Education and heads up the Contemporary Indigenous Governance and Knowledge Systems research theme at the Northern Institute of Charles Darwin University. Professor Christie worked in Yolŋu communities as a teacher linguist in the 1970s and 1980s, and started the Yolŋu Studies program at the Northern Territory University, now CDU, in 1994. After working with the Faculty of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies and the School of Education, he moved to the Northern Institute in 2010. Michael's current research interests cover a range of collaborative, transdisciplinary projects in Indigenous contexts, which involve careful investigation into diverse knowledge practices and methods. A key part of collaborative transdisciplinary methodology is avoiding simplification into received categories and maintaining research websites that have become a key aspect of that work. Michael has been a very strong advocate of Australian languages, and when I say Australian languages I mean the languages that have been here for millennia. And this is really important work both in the context of the Northern Territory and elsewhere across Australia, and thinking about I guess mind images of how you might consider Michael's lifelong work in this area. I think of him at a campfire helping Yolŋu people keep their language practice strong, and I think we're at a point in time now where that fire that's been kept so strong in the north should be encouraged to spread throughout the rest of the lands of the continent. So Michael has worked through very difficult times in many respects, keeping that fire going. I've been made aware this week through high-level discussions with Northern Territory Education that bilingual education and the benefits of teaching people in both languages is back on the agenda. It's always seemed like a common sense approach to me, but it's only through the work of people like Michael who have kept those ideas and those concepts on the agenda for them to come back again. I've said enough, and I will now hand it over to Professor Michael Christie. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks everybody for coming along. I too would like to acknowledge the Larrakia people on whose land we are, and particularly to acknowledge the fact that they have never ceded their sovereignty. And one of the things that we're working on at the moment at CDU is thinking carefully about sovereignty, and I may hope to, if I get to the end of the talk, make a few comments about that at the end of what I have to say. This talk that I'm going to give is in a sense a recycled, partly recycled talk from the conference that Michaela was organising in Sydney, the 4S conference, when Helen, Veron and I were asked to participate in a panel about socio-technologies. I had already been talking to Helen about the ongoing issue of Yolŋu Aboriginal, the MLA for East Arnhem, whose request for being able to speak as Yolŋu language in Parliament and in Darwin had been refused by the Standing Orders Committee, and it made me think of language in the sense that that Yolŋu was talking about it as a socio-technology, and so we talked a little bit about that in our talk in Sydney, and I will probably, hopefully, make some reference to that a little further along. There you go, Louise. There's a seat just there for you. So I think talking about socio-technologies and thinking about language as a socio-technology is where I want to focus my talk today. So just taking a couple of things out of the original blurb for this symposium, talking about collaborative knowledge work in Northern Australia and the whole ongoing question about how STS may be useful in the work of transdisciplinary research. And I think it's good to note that transdisciplinary research is research which goes beyond the disciplines of a university. Within the university you've got interdisciplinary research and multidisciplinary. Transdisciplinary, you're actually working with a knowledge practice which is quite alien to the knowledge practices of a university. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might find STS useful in this transdisciplinary research, which is, in our case, working mostly with Aboriginal knowledge authorities. I'm going to use the whole idea of translating and interpreting, which has bugged me for 40 years, as a way of teasing open some of the notions of metaphysics that come out of different uses of language as a socio-technology. Then I'm going to have three little examples, one about both ways education, one about health communication research that Annie Lowell and Minority Thereorta have been helping us with some years ago, and another one about housing research that Louise knows about and that Matt Campbell helped me with. Then I will talk a little bit about English in the NT Parliament and some reflections on that ongoing issue, and then make some final comments. This definition of STS, Science and Technology Studies, also came from the stuff that was sent to us from, I think, from Michaela. And I particularly like that definition because it talks about STS as something which helps non-Indigenous researchers to unpick the assumptions that are already embedded in their own knowledge practices. So it's a way of saying to non-Indigenous researchers, hang on a minute, think carefully about what are the assumptions that you're bringing about your knowledge work to your collaborations. And it also provides resources for thinking about new forms of situated talking and working together. And one of the resources, I think, are these socio-technologies, which are practices which are or processes which are both utterly social and utterly technical, and social insofar as they become technical, and technical they become social, and so it's a way of thinking about things that are going on in the world without trying to make the separations between the social and the technical, which is a very useful thing to do if you're working with Aboriginal people, which everything is made out of language, and so that the boundary between the social and the technical doesn't actually exist. So it's a good way of non-Indigenous researchers stepping back and thinking about that. Particularly, and this is the part of the panel that we were doing in the Sydney thing, talking about these infrastructures as things that materialise ways of doing different insides and outsides, borders and boundaries, samenesses and differences, which a lot of people have been talking about today in the symposium. How do we use our STS sensibilities to think about how samenesses and differences are made, sometimes quite unwittingly by us, or assumed by us in the way that we bring those things to our research and education work. So just thinking about translating and interpreting. This is a bit nerve-wracking for me, this bit, because it's starting to make some controversial claims, but I have always been conscious of the fact that for Western linguists particularly, and I just got this random image off the internet, translating and interpreting are basically the same thing. Translation, you do it with text; interpreting, you do it orally, but there is always an assumption that it's possible to turn from one language and into another a vision of the world that's out there, and you can do your work as long as you remember that there's nothing that's in the original text that doesn't end up in the translation, and there's nothing in the translation that wasn't in the original text, and you do your best to try to preserve some of the idiom as you're going along. Which of course is very easy if you're just translating a story like the ones that Kathy has in the Living Archive, including that one, which is the story of an old lady telling me in the 1970s about what happened the first time she ever saw a white person. Lovely story in the Yolŋu language, able to make it into also a lovely story in English without doing too much violence to the story, even though there's lots of stuff implied in the Yolŋu story that can't go into the translation and the other way around. But when you're getting into the work of doing medical interpreting, for example, trying to do the work of making a literal translation of biomedical certainties in the Yolŋu language can be quite difficult, impossible, invasive and unproductive. And I will use the example of medical interpreting to talk a little bit about that. But first, let me just make a dangerous dualistic claim about different ways in which languages can be used as socio-technologies. The ones that we in academia are mostly familiar with is the notion that there is a world out there, that language cuts nature at its joints, and languages can be enlisted variously to make representations of a single pre-existing external reality. Or some people think of language as a socio-technology, and this is what we've been talking about a lot today, collaborative world making, as Nori was talking about it today. Simon was talking about the eternally unfolding present, the way in which languages actually participate in making new understandings, new agreements about possible worlds that are coming into being. Now, I'm not for a moment saying that language, English does that one and Yolŋu languages do that one, but I am saying that because, representing is actually also a sort of form of participation, and participation always has some sort of representation in it, even if you're just representing the people that you're talking on behalf of, so that they're all a bit mixed up. But STS helps us to unpack some of the assumptions that are embedded in our Western knowledge practices, including this fantasy of a direct relation between words and realities out there. So trying to think about how language is a socio-technology that can be enlisted to do a whole lot of work collaboratively across cultural boundaries, productively and honestly and respectfully. So 3 examples. The first one is this whole notion of both ways education. Helen started talking a little bit about that in her talk this afternoon, about when she was first at Yirrkala in the late 1980s, where I first met her and we were working together. The students that she had been working with had been at Bachelor for long enough for them to have gained the confidence of being able to talk to the elders in the community who would come into the school and say, hang on a minute, the way in which you've been doing education is not quite the way that we think ought to be done if we're going to be respectful to the land and to the children and to their history. By the time I got to Yirrkala, I had already been at Milingimbi, further west, for 10 years as a teacher linguist when bilingual education started up. And it was basically using Yolŋu language to do the same old curriculum. So it's basically the same old curriculum, same old documents, and Kathy's picture of the little boy eating the apple and somebody's pasted over a Benin word on the thing, a perfect example. So that for the first 10 years or so of bilingual education, there was a fantasy of just sort of more of the same, but just do it in the Aboriginal languages. By the time I got to Yirrkala, people were saying, hang on a minute, no, we need to rethink the nature of education, the nature of knowledge, the collaborative way in which it's produced, and it involves a different use of language, they weren't saying it like this, as a socio-technology, a different metaphysics about where knowledge comes from. So, like Matt, I'm not going to read out the points on the PowerPoint then, but just basically saying that there were particular points about language and place and identity and difference and coming together to produce knowledge which was foundational to a Yolŋu understanding of both ways education, and of course in other places all around Australia where this sort of stuff was going on, other forms of both ways education, two ways education started sprouting up, and still today Bachelor Institute itself has a commitment to both ways education, and as always then and now, some white people get it and some white people don't quite get it, and there's often a bit of a tension between the two, trying to persuade people that it's not just talking in a different language and you have to be a learner. So that the whole thing, in a sense, it seems to me, looking back, was an effort to sort of basically telling the non-Indigenous people in no uncertain terms that their knowledge is useful and valuable as long as it's in place, as long as it's situated, as long as it's produced as a narrative respectfully alongside others, and that we're working together to use these different knowledge practices to produce new knowledge here in place, and what Simon was calling actionable understanding. It's good that we've already had some of these other talks this afternoon, because I feel like I'm sort of flowing along with what everybody else has been saying, so I don't need to push it too hard. The other thing that was interesting about that at Yirrkala was the way in which trying to get the authorities in the Department of Education, that Barry was just talking about, coming back around to talking about bilingual education again, to realise that in that sort of education, the curriculum documents emerge out of the work that's done together. You're never quite sure who's going to learn what, but you do know that you're going to have a good way of recording what each child did, whether they're 3 years old or whether they're a school teacher or whether, however, and the elders, what they have said, in drawings and representations, ways of demonstrating to the funding authorities the good knowledge has happened here and people have learnt to read and write and sing and paint and dance, as a way of justifying retrospectively the work that was done in the classroom more often out bush. So that's the example that they use, of course, and we still have the Guruma Festival every year where it's built on that metaphor of an open public space where people are invited under the authority of the people that own the place to come and to celebrate and to join their knowledges together in an open place. Secret, sacred knowledge has got nothing to do with it. It's none of our business. It doesn't happen in the Guruma. It happens somewhere else with different names for that sort of knowledge. This is knowledge for anybody that wants to come along in good faith and to be part of the system. second example. This is the one where we were working with Annie over here and Laura to a large extent on health communication research. When I first came to Darwin in the 1990s, when Greg was here, he was, I think he's the only person that's still at the university that was here when I was here, and he's still here, and he's still a great friend and comfort. We were asked by, I think, Annie and other people, and Alan Cass, who's now the head of the Menzies Research Centre, to work on, I don't know, you can tell us the true story about this if they're telling the true stories, the communication breakdown in the context of renal treatment. And I was working with a woman, a Yolŋu woman whose name was Betty, and she was a linguist and also a renal patient, and between the two of us we were given a great big long statement in biomedical English about kidney function, you know, corpuscles and what do they call them? Glomularises and nephrons and phosphorus and things like that, trying to find ways of moving a text from English, biomedical English, into a Yolŋu language, and every time I didn't want to do it. I knew that if we did as best as we could, you could never get a back translation that went back and would make sense anyway. And every time we got stuck, Betty would just start telling stories. And the ways in which the researchers were led round to the idea of thinking about knowledge work and developing informed consent about ways forward with treatment for people often happened in a Gurrama-like setting where people were telling stories and sharing their stories together. So in fact the project was renamed as Sharing the True Stories, and there in fact is a URL for an enormous website curated by Annie, I think, telling the story about that project and the ways in which using that metaphor of collaborating together, using languages as ways of deciding ways forward, using languages for doing insides and outsides, boundary making and things like that, actually gave Aboriginal people the chance for their bodies to be part of the conversation as well as the biomedical body, so that the biomedical discourses had a particular sort of body that they were working with. Aboriginal people had their own bodies, their own stories about their bodies, where stories about life, health, sickness, treatment, who suffers when somebody's sick, does the environment suffer when people are sick, various ways of extending out the whole conversation about sickness and treatment options that used quite a different understanding of how language produces these ways of going forward. And in a sense, looking backwards and seeing the way in which those horrible translations into English of difficult concepts in biomedical English was actually in sort of an invasion of the sovereign bodies of Aboriginal people that were undergoing renal problems and finding ways forward for their care, which involved not only the nephrologist but the nutritionist and the social worker and the person that organises the flights backwards and forwards, and a whole team of people, and trying to work out ways of doing cases so that you're not just one person with one person. So there's ways of sort of institutional arrangements that come out of ways of thinking about making consent together by using languages in quite different ways. And it did, after some while, and a lot of more conversations and discussions about representations and messages and health literacy and health communication, into this sort of collaborative design of what we call the touchpad body, which is a communication device which is sort of ambiguous enough to interrupt the assumptions of the people that are obsessively biomedical, and allowed to give people the chance to have conversations about what's going on, what are the ways forward for treatment, and options for what to do next. So trying to think about ways of developing material devices that are able to do the work of bringing together different bodies and making them agree here and now on particular ways forward without any sort of larger biomedical discourse that's sort of working out there in the air somewhere rather than pertaining to a particular issue. I hope I've explained that all right. Third little example. This was another one. This was an ARC project that I was, a big ARC project about Aboriginal housing a few years ago. And Matt became involved in this one as well. I guess everybody here knows what an intractable problem Aboriginal housing is, particularly after all the Aboriginal housing associations were disbanded and all the housing in remote Aboriginal communities were compulsorily acquired by the Northern Territory Housing Department. Questions about who gets which house, who makes the decisions, who owns the houses, and housing design and a whole lot of other questions like that kept coming up. We were lucky enough to be able to do some of this this research work, and I was lucky enough to be able to do some of the research work in Yolŋu languages at Galiwanko, and also here when people came in from various places for workshops about this about these issues, and just a couple of little stories that come out of that, talking about the ways again in which people use language to steer the conversation into quite a different direction from those which are assumed by the governments or by the researchers. One of them was a man at Galiwanko who, when he was asked about issues to do with his housing, he stood up outside his house and he used the word for the resting place of the shark and said, "This is my house, this is the name of my house." When everybody knows that this is my house because of the name of the house, other people have got other houses, but because they belong to different clan groups, their houses are all completely different. This is my house, it's a special house, it's a place where I rest, it's a place where my people are safe. And so basically telling a long story about how using the model of the resting place for his totemic shark was a way of telling the government and the researchers that doing good housing is in fact doing good governance, and it's good governance insofar as it's consistent with ancestral ways of understanding you and your place and how it relates to other places and people around. You're not actually Jambarapong, but you're not on Jambarapong or land, it belongs to somebody else, but there are ways of being who you are in place as long as you understand the governance of housing. And in fact the second example is the ways in which when people were invited to draw pictures of houses and tell stories about houses, talking about the ways in which houses have their own discipline. You might have heard the word rapery. Rapery is often used nowadays as some sort of top-down discipline with telling naughty boys what to do and how to behave themselves. But in fact, it's much more to do with a proper, correct, honest, ancestrally congruent way of behaving. And the important thing is that houses themselves have rapery. They do governance. If they're properly designed and properly organised, they can have the agency to make sure that children are safe, that young men are doing the right thing, and that young women are doing the right things, babies are doing the right things. Some people are upstairs looking out over the young men, some people are downstairs. Everybody's got their job to do. The house is designed in such a way that good governance is actually inscribed into the design of the house. Another thing that you white people need to learn, houses have this agency, and if we use these ancestral words, Leo Damala, the head of the eagle, as one of the ways of describing that house, as a way of persuading people that houses actually have work to do when they're properly designed, so we need to be very collaborative, cooperative about how we organise not only the design of the houses but the deployment of the houses, who gets the houses, how they're situated with each other, and stories about how in the old days people would have their shelters oriented towards where their traditional land was. Okay, so they're my three examples. I will pause for another sweep. So I was asked to make a bit of a comment about this. Some of you may have been at Ben Grimes's excellent seminar a couple of weeks ago about this particular issue. If you weren't, there is a Vimeo thing of Ben's talk. Yolŋu is the MLA, for member of the Legislative Assembly for East Arnhem, where Golden Court and Millingimby and those other places where we have been working, and Yirrkala, where I lived for a long time. 90% of all the people in that, I'm just guessing, but it would be more than 90% of all the people speak Yolŋu languages as their first language. Yolŋu was very keen to be able to speak his language, Yolŋu language, in Parliament first when he got up to speak, and then he would be quite happy to speak in English after that. Ben's seminar was very much to do with the fact that the Northern Territory is the only legislation in Australia where you have to speak English. None of the other ones you have to do that. A lot of it was to do with human rights. A lot of it was to do with the history of other places like New Zealand, where they've been speaking Māori in Parliament since 1860 something or other. So a lot of the discussion that was being put into arguing with the Standing Orders Committee, the rules that govern how you run a Parliament are actually just organised by the Parliament themselves. They just have a little committee that make the rules, so there's no laws about it. And so he was submitting to the Standing Orders Committee, asking them for permission to speak Yolŋu first, and then he'd be happy to speak English after that. And at the end of Ben's seminar, Yolŋu got up and he said words, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but words to the effect that the reason why I want to speak Yolŋu is because when I get up, I speak Yolŋu because it is my language and I am representing my people, and I feel strong and powerful, and I feel like I'm the right person for this place when I speak my language first. So the general idea that the Standing Orders Committee came up with that his English wasn't quite up to scratch and that he needed to speak Yolŋu first had nothing to do with it really, as I understand Yolŋu's position. And I'm saying that out of a long experience. Before Yolŋu was at the MLA, he was the Yolŋu lecturer here, before Nori came on board, and we got a large sum of money from the government to practice this thing called teaching from country, where Yolŋu there is way out in Arnhem Land, a place called Damyarka, talking about where his land came from, his own authority to speak, the kin that he's got there. So it was a way of doing remote education in such a way that the teachers were remote and the students were all here rather than the other way around. And often saying, you know, when I'm here and I'm standing on my country and I'm teaching you about this, I know that I'm the right person for this place. I can see the clouds, I can see the trees, I can smell it, I can feel the breeze on the thing. I know I can speak my language and I'm the right person for this place. If you want more on that, there is a very big website there, Teaching from Country, that you can have a look at. And in fact, those people that were here talking about boundary objects before, Susan Lee Starr, one of the person that invented them, was actually here for that seminar. We got her over and took her out to Arnhem Land, and she did some work thinking about knowledge and place and language as part of that. It seemed to me as though the standing committee had sort of got the wrong end of the stick in a sense, but it also became quite clear that when I was agitating that we make that sort of a metaphysical argument to the standing audit committees about representation as being something that involved the right language in the right place in the first order, it was deemed to be a little bit a bridge too far in terms of trying to make the political argument, and so we continue to maintain arguments that are to do with rights and to do with other jurisdictions and histories of that sort of arrangement. He wants to be able to speak Yolŋu, and then he's perfectly happy to speak, and he's perfectly fluent in speaking English after he's done that. They say, no, he has to speak English first, and if he wants to speak Yolŋu Mata, he has to provide a transcription and a translation, and so that the interpreter service has gone into a flurry saying, well, it could be done, but in a sense, just thinking about language as a socio-technology, there's more to it than that. We can think about it better and more differently, but it does mean us standing back from some of our assumptions. So there's really the point, back to the original point about STS as being methods for unpicking or unpacking the assumptions that are already embedded in our practices. That's another example of how there are assumptions embedded in the practices of governance in the Northern Territory that can actually be thought through in different ways. The politics of trying to argue those different ways of thinking are, of course, quite strenuous. Okay, so that's basically me, but I just want to finish by introducing you to we have always done a lot of research collaboratively at CDU with Aboriginal people in different places in the centre and all over, and some of you have been here today, you've seen good examples of all that. Now with the university restructure, the university is encouraging us to form collaborations of researchers. Barry and Linda Fort, whom you may know, are heading up a particular, what they call a design lab, which is called the Indigenous Sovereign Practices in Research and Education, as a way of thinking through how do we understand the most fundamental aspects of the collaborative research that we're doing at CDU. And I guess my concluding comments is really that I've tried to tell stories about the sovereign body in medical, the sovereign space for people, how they need to be taken seriously first before any of the other things come along. So housing, the ways in which Aboriginal stories about what a house is, what it does, what it should be doing, what it can do, are the things that are the sovereign representations to which knowledge work and research work needs to be attached, so that there's something to do with the sovereign practices as being sort of ontologically prior to the work that's done, and the ways in which science and technology studies allows us to do the standing back sufficiently to be able to see what are the sensibilities that we need in order to be able to do this collaborative work in a way which is very insightful, but which in fact produces new, different ways of going on together, as people have been saying today, in good faith. So that's just me trying to bring the STS question and our research back to the wider question of how we're working here at CDU in our collaborative research. And that's all for me. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take comments or questions.
Michael, one of the points you had on your slide was translation as colonisation. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Only that It's very easy in the medical context for you to see medical practitioners not respecting Aboriginal knowledge of Aboriginal bodies, that Aboriginal people have their own stories about health, sickness, treatment, and the ways in which Western biomedical discourse says if somebody's sick, the sickness is somehow inside the body, whereas other stories say, no, that the family's suffering as well. The environment may be suffering as well. So that as soon as you get a text in English that has biomedical certainties encoded with it, and then you think that you're solving the problem by turning that into another language, you're actually participating in a sort of colonising process. It's a bit of a strong statement, but I think it's worth making.
I think there's another example of colonisation in the Yolŋu story. I might be reading too much into it, but I suspect that the view that people are taking is that English is the normal way to express clear information. And if someone wants to talk in another language, that's suboptimal, and they need to translate it into English. And you said that the Standing Committee might have got the wrong end of the stick in understanding why Yolŋu wanted to speak his language. And I'm sure that's correct, but I'm not sure if it's an accident that they got the wrong end of the stick. I suspect it reflects some assumptions or ideologies that they have about language and about the role of translation and what it would mean for that Yolŋu language to be translated into English for a person.
Right, yes, so you're saying that not only did they think that he wasn't quite up to it, but they were saying that the language isn't quite up to it either. That
I'm sure they didn't say that, but I'm just sort of
yeah, good point.
There might be an ideology in there somewhere.
Yeah.
About the communication research,
Yeah.
because Yolŋu, when a patient, when they get sick or doctor explaining, and the language that they use is to biomedical language. But you don't understand why he or she talks about it. And that's why sometimes we have miscommunication with the doctor.
Yeah.
We don't understand each other why he's telling your patient and your is saying nothing to their hand.
Yeah.
And knowing that doctor is like to him, the patient, your patient is understanding what he's asking.
Yeah.
But we say yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
And thinking that, for example, maybe renal, we think that those support or doctor tell us, we think that it will save or solve the problem. But we think it's the doctor thinking that it's continuing
Yeah.
because of the communication is
Yeah, and I think maybe Annie might say something about this, that as it turned out with that research, what we found that was needed was for the doctors to be told how to use an interpreter, and that they needed an interpreter, that the doctors need to be told that there's something about the way that they think about language and medical reality that's actually wrong, and that they need to be encouraged and more than encouraged to think carefully about the sorts of things that are happening when people are speaking English to patients.
Not knowing, then when doctors say he knows that it's a long-term sickness, but we're thinking, are we going to get better next year?
Yeah.
And that's what you want,
Yeah.
because of the communication
Yeah.
and the language we use is different. And for Yolŋu, because Yolŋu, when he talks at the parliament, he talks like strongly, have to get it out, or tell strong, or talk for your people strongly,
Yeah,
what we wanted, you know,
Yeah.
because he's a rep for Yolŋu. So we depending him to talk to us.
Yeah.
And so he sometimes talk on that.
Yeah. And he feels the need that he needs to do that first.
Because we have to express ourselves and who we are. And then we get Valanda later
Yeah.
to keep us going with that.
Yeah.
So there is a now like when I went to Perinaal Days Farewell in Melbourne, I stood up and I talked in Yolŋu language when there was a lot of Valanda there, and one Valanda there was interpreting. We were talking about same thing, acknowledging her work that she does in Yolŋu language.
Yeah. And you did that at Louisa's wedding too.
Strong, I think strong feeling to talk.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Do these sorry, you go there.
Can I ask a question? Michael, you mentioned New Zealand as another example, and apologies I haven't been here all day, so I don't know in what context you mentioned that, but one of the things I find kind of amazing in Australia when universities, other institutions talk about the place of Aboriginal people and culture in society, they often look to Canada or New Zealand, these other contexts around the world, and point out the strength of culture and language in those places without acknowledging that there is strength in those other places because of constitutional rights or legal protections to practice language and culture. And I just want your reflections on that as someone who must be very frustrated that in Australia we take a step forward and then 2 steps back depending on who's voted into power.
I think that you've made there's not a lot more that I can say about that, except of course that there are many languages, except of course that Creole and Aboriginal English are not properly recognised as being Aboriginal languages. But also there's to me, the most important insight from my work with Yolŋu is to do with the identity between language and place. And as the ancestors moved from place to place, they changed their language as they went to a new place, a new environment, new language. So that language, the world is created by language. And I think that, Maoris in New Zealand, they arrived in New Zealand and they found the place like scientists do. So it's actually quite a different metaphysics at work there. And I'm really interested in how do we take seriously the metaphysics of English, Aboriginal English and Creole and local languages in order to take a step back from our presuppositions as academic researchers. And I think that the examples from New Zealand can only be taken so far on that sort of thing. But I think, the whole international rights thing is something that we need to be talking about at the same time, but they're not the same issue.
I heard Chris Sarah on the radio a few weeks ago talking about how the insistence of teaching kids in Aboriginal communities in English was actually racist because of the assumption that it made that our language and our culture are superior to yours. Would you have any comment about that?
I think that's absolutely true. Was it the one where you said I was the youngest of 10 kids and the only time I wasn't Aboriginal was when I was on the football field? I think absolutely, and that people need to take children's languages seriously, and not only Aboriginal languages, but all languages as acknowledging of their identity. So any classroom regime that prioritises standard Australian English as being the only way to do knowledge properly is inherently racist. I think we would have to agree on that.
Thank you.
So let's all thank Michael again.
Thank you very much.